This is the Albury Pioneer Cemetery, located in a flight path. I just want to have a quick look at a grave over here because I found it interesting. So the little statue has collapsed and the headstone has obviously seen better days. This is the grave of Elizabeth Ann Windsor. Elizabeth Windsor, well there you go, that's interesting. But what I find super interesting about this one is that little plinth on which once a statue stood. You can see on the bottom of it that the plinth is actually made from recycled pieces of other gravestones, and that's kind of cool. It's not uncommon, it's just frugal and efficient use of materials, but it's cool. This is the Albury Pioneer Cemetery, located in North Albury. This cemetery is kind of made up of two parts, separated by a main road, but also kind of not, because they're kind of two completely different cemeteries, but also not. This half is the Albury Pioneer Cemetery, established in 1848, and this half is the Albury New Cemetery, or the Waugh Road Cemetery, which was established in 1925. So it's not that new. It's a century old, but it's newer than this part. There are a number of things about this cemetery, or these cemeteries, that are interesting, not the least of which is that if there's a street in Albury named after a person, it's very likely that person is buried in this cemetery. For example, Englehart, Wise, Mudge, Dite, Lamport, Mitchell, Griffith, Lancaster, Seller, Fallon, Schuback, Rao, Fraunfelder, Dallinger, Dick, Gehrig, Merkel, Rice, Strauss, Zeller, Ryan, McLennan, Blacklock, Frere, Nagel, Daly, Leighton, Munro, Affleck, McEachin, Haig, Wilson, Abacare, Padman, Burrows, Brown, Gale, Payne, Golson, Box, Shippard, Solomon. There's plenty of local pastoral and agricultural and political history right here. There's also this. This is a Lychgate, or at least it's kind of a reproduction of one. This particular gate was built in 1987 by students of the local TAFE College, who built it to replicate the original Lychgate that was here as early as 1934. And I have to say, for something that was built by TAFE students, it's held up pretty well. So what's a Lychgate, and why is it significant? Well, they're not super common for a start. And they're linked to a bunch of weird old traditions, which is always fun. The word Lychgate literally means corpse gate, which gives you a bit of a hint about what it was used for getting dead people into the cemetery. In the Middle Ages, back in merry old England, the little roofed area was used as kind of a holding station for the deceased, where they'd be wrapped in a shroud and parked while they waited for burial. This could have taken many days back in the Middle Ages, and often family members would sit with the corpse during the wait to both maintain a vigil for the dead and also to shoo away grave robbers and other ne'er-do-wells. In more modern times, the little roofed area has also served as a waiting station, but not for such long durations. Often the deceased would be placed at the Lychgate to await the arrival of the clergyman who would perform the burial rites or the funeral ceremony. Really, nowadays, it's just a cool gate. A Lychgate is a liminal space. They're designed to deliberately create a separation between the hustle and bustle of the debaucherous outside world and the serenity of the consecrated ground inside the cemetery. And I kind of get that, and it's kind of cool. There's another old myth, or superstition, about Lychgates. Many people used to believe that the spirit of the last person to be buried in the cemetery would haunt the Lychgate until they were relieved by another burial. Apparently there would even be fights between families of mourners about who would be buried first. The thing is though, I can't figure out if they were fighting to have their family member buried first so that their ghost would move on immediately, or if they were fighting to go last so that their loved one's spirit would hang around just a little bit longer. This is another somewhat unique aspect of the Albury Pioneer Cemetery. This is a Chinese funerary burner, and it's one of maybe a dozen across New South Wales. These were built, as the name suggests, by the contemporaries of Chinese immigrants who were buried here, and most of them date back to the era of the Victorian and New South Wales gold rushes. So the 1860s and all the way up to the industrial era around the turn of the 20th century. It's no coincidence that you'll mostly find these types of burners at cemeteries in towns that have arisen on or near sites where gold was prolific in the late 1800s, because gold was a huge attractor for Chinese immigrants to Australia. More on that later. This is considered quite a modest burner. There are much more elaborate burners at cemeteries, mostly in Victoria, but this one is quite plain. These burners were used to burn symbolic tributes, including paper replicas of food, furniture, money, worldly possessions. Burning these items would allow them to pass through the veil into the spirit realm so that they could help the deceased out in the afterlife. Chinese burial traditions are complicated. Chinese immigrants who came to Australia during the gold rush often planned, or hoped at least, to be able to return to China before they died, but this obviously wasn't always the case. I'm sure the dangers of mining and the realities of the gold economy and a million other life choices got in the way of that, but the desire to be buried on Chinese soil remained. So there was a system put in place which is now referred to as the repatriation of bones. When a Chinese person passed away, they would be temporarily buried in a shallow grave. Then after a number of years, their bones would be retrieved and sent back to the homeland for proper burial near their ancestors. What that means for Chinese graves in this cemetery, I'm not sure, but it's interesting to know. And the funerary burner is a wonderful piece of history. This is the grave of John, or Jack, or Black Jack Iliffe, who, among other things, once made a small fortune out of someone else's cabbages. On one occasion, he and a mate were out riding about 10 miles from Beechworth when they came upon a fine paddock of about 10 acres of splendid cabbages. The paddock belonged to old Dr. Stitt, and Jack Iliffe went up to him and offered to buy the crop. After a bit of bargaining, he bought the whole of the 10 acres of cabbage for £20 and brought out carts from Beechworth to take them away. You could not get a vegetable of any kind in Beechworth, as all the ground was pegged out for gold mining claims, and Jack sold the whole crop of cabbages at £1 apiece. He made quite a little fortune out of the transaction, and the miners had cabbage at every meal for a week. Not only did Jack help to feed the miners during the gold rush, at least with cabbages, but he also stood up for the rights of the Chinese immigrant miners, who were not looked upon fondly by the, let's face it, incredibly racist European gold miners who didn't care for immigrants, and especially not those who were also mining for gold. In 1857, there was a fairly significant race riot that occurred in the Buckland Valley, now known as the Buckland Riots, in which Jack Iliffe was involved. I mentioned racism before. Just to take the temperature of the era of history that we're talking about here, I'm just going to quote a passage or two from an article from the Ovens and Murray Advertiser from July of 1857. This is from a real newspaper. The Chinese question has entered on a new phase, exasperated by the perpetual interference of the, I'm not saying that, with their mining pursuits, and alarmed at the overwhelming numbers continually pouring in on them. The Buckland diggers of European origin have taken law into their own hands. On Saturday, a large body of Europeans collected, attacked the Chinese in their tents, drove them out, set fire to what was inflammable, and literally consumed their habitations and their stores. Pursuing the, I'm definitely not saying that, down the river, each of their encampments and its tenants, in its turn, was served in the same way until some 1,500, I'm still not saying that, trembling and panting before their pursuers, evinced their manhood and their courage by fleeing before 200 or 300 angry members of the Anglo-Saxon race. The whole white population, even to their very domestic animals, the dogs, have manifested such a deadly hatred towards the Chinese that had they been wise, they would have taken themselves out of the way long ago. And that was a legitimate report from an actual newspaper. Some reporter was paid to write that, and some editor went, yeah, that's great, and put it to print. If you ever think that we're not progressing as people, we are. We've got a ways to go, but we're definitely moving forward anyway. Black Jack Iliffe was one of evidently very few who supported the Chinese miners. When the riots on the Buckland took place and the whites in the mining camp rose against the Chinese and gave them a terrible hiding, Jack Iliffe stood up for the Chinese, and his advocacy of their cause was so successful that the police inspector on duty at the camp promoted him to be a sort of special service officer, and Black Jack thoroughly justified his appointment. Jack passed away at the age of 70 in 1903 and is buried here. Curiosity Mine is on Patreon. Patreon is a service that allows you to directly support your favourite creators to allow them to continue making the content that you love. No kangaroos this time. If you enjoy these videos and you think Curiosity Mine deserves your support, head on over to patreon.com/curiositymine for more information on how you can support the channel directly. If you do, you'll get your name on this list of amazing people who are supporting the channel already. Thank you. Head on over to patreon.com/curiositymine or curiositymine.com/Patreon. All roads lead to Rome, but for now, this road leads to the cemetery. And here's a peculiar but fascinating story to end on. In 2012, there was a massive rainstorm that passed through Albury, and along with the usual broken tree branches and localised flooding, the things you get in every storm, this one also brought with it a sinkhole in the cemetery, which opened up right here. So what do you do when a sinkhole appears in your cemetery? Do you grab a shovel and fill it in? Of course not. You get a dude to climb inside and write a scientific paper about it. So that's what happened. For some reason that absolutely baffles me, a rumour immediately started that the cavity, the void that opened up, was the remains of a World War II air raid shelter. I honestly have no words for how stupid that idea is. This is a cemetery. Holes in cemeteries tend to be graves, or vaults, or crypts. My first thought would not have been air raid shelter, but
a person is smart, people are dumb.
Anyway, it is a vault, and in addition, it turned out, much to the relief of the squeamish, that it's an empty vault, but it is a legitimate burial vault, and it's one with some fairly insane history behind it. This is the original burial vault of the Hoare family, Hoare. Yes, it's an awkward name, let's all have a giggle and then get over it. This plot on which the vault lies was purchased outright by John Hoare a bazillion years ago on the understanding that when he and his wife died, they were to be buried here. Pretty typical.
What could possibly go wrong?
Due to the nature of the purchase, this plot of land belongs to the Hoare family in perpetuity, and it's technically a tiny little patch of private property despite being within what is effectively a public cemetery. In 1895, Elizabeth Hoare died at the age of 82 years, and she was brought back from Melbourne to Albury to be buried in the family crypt that John Hoare had purchased and built. It should have been pretty straightforward. Burial in the vault. No questions asked. But there were questions asked because, wait for it, John Hoare's family vault is in the Catholic section of the cemetery, and his wife Elizabeth was a Protestant, a member of the Church of England. For obvious reasons, the Catholic priest at the time not only refused to officiate the funeral and the burial, but also declined to sanction the interment of her body in consecrated ground. Thanks to a legal loophole, mostly just the fact that John Hoare owned the ground in which his wife was buried, regardless of which denomination of church claimed divine ownership of it. As much as the church wanted to argue, they really couldn't stop the burial, so the burial went ahead, and Elizabeth Hoare was placed into this vault. But in an almost Monty Python-esque display of comedic spite, the Anglican priest officiated the burial here from somewhere over there, in the Anglican section of the cemetery. Somewhere over here. So the Anglican Church didn't want to stand on Catholic ground to bury an Anglican woman on private property in the middle of the Catholic part of the cemetery. And of course the Catholic Church had no problem with any of this. Right. To make their equally vindictive position clear, the Catholic clergy insisted that the cemetery erect 4 black posts around the vault site to clearly indicate that this particular patch of ground was no longer consecrated by the Catholic Church. And to be even more actively rancorous about it, they made sure that the black posts were positioned just outside the boundaries of the Hoare family's patch of private property so that the family couldn't do anything about it. So the tiny square of land in which this vault lies is what's called profane earth. That doesn't mean that the dirt swears a lot. Well, I kind of wish that it did. What it means is that this ground has been deconsecrated by the church. It's a fairly uncommon thing. It tends to only happen when churches are transferred between denominations or sold off as private property and they need to unchurch the ground before it gets passed on. Kind of like when, people buy old churches and turn them into Airbnbs or whatever. And you'd think that would be the whole story, but if you'll recall, this vault is empty. John Hoare didn't much care for the arrangement imposed on his family by both the Catholic and Anglican churches, so in the interim months between his wife's passing and his own death, he purchased 2 more plots in the Anglican, or Church of England section of the cemetery. He had his wife's body relocated to there, and in his will he insisted, with a significant payment to the priest of £20, about $4,000 in today's money, that a Catholic priest deliver rites over his burial, which did not happen because spite. So what we're left with is 2 graves in the Church of England section of the cemetery for a Catholic and a Protestant, and an empty vault in the Catholic section that isn't really in the Catholic section at all because it was unconsecrated after the burial of Elizabeth Hoare in early 1895, and I'm wildly assuming has never been reconsecrated since, given that it's a perpetual private plot and can never be used by anyone else, why would it be? I'm just going to record this part as I walk all the way back from the final resting place of the Hoare couple to the site of their original vault, just to give you an idea of exactly how far away these 2 spots are. When the vault was examined in 2012 following the flooding that exposed it, it was found to be a typical Victorian-era barrel vault with a curved ceiling, and it had an arched entrance doorway with steel lintels, and it would have at some point had a wooden floor, but that's long since rotted away. There were a couple of pieces of decorative ceramics and a flower vase fashioned from an old wine bottle found inside the crypt, and not a lot else. I'll put a link to the rapid survey paper that gives heaps of details and also heaps of photos of the crypt in the YouTube video description. If you're interested, it's worth a look. I'm still not there yet. It's all the way over here. Oh look, I can see it. So yeah, that's how far away they ended up getting buried from the actual location of their original vault, which, I remind you, Mr. Hoare paid a ton of money for and owns still. Anyway, that's fun. So this is a spectacularly beautiful old cemetery located right in the middle of the city of Albury, between the northern suburb and shopping district of Lavington and the Albury CBD to the south. Like a lot of old cemeteries, this one was placed here because at the time of its opening it was considered to be far enough away from the town to not offend anyone, but also close enough to be accessible. And like every single one of those old cemeteries, it now finds itself right in the middle of town again. I've mentioned many times before that I love cemeteries. They're always peaceful places with an overabundance of love and respect that you don't tend to find in many other places these days. If you're going to take a walk in the park, consider taking a walk in a cemetery instead. They're amazing places, and everything inside of them is a museum exhibit and a museum all of its own. I will include links in the description to a couple of great documents from the Albury Historical Society about the Pioneer Cemetery, as well as the rapid survey paper from the Hoare family vault. I recommend having a read. It's pretty interesting. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Curiosity Mine on YouTube, and if you think the channel deserves it, maybe even supporting Curiosity Mine directly via Patreon. The links are in the description. And thank you, while I point with my tripod, for watching.